right, so today we are going to kind of take a step back and just kind of recap everything that we've talked about in Chapter 9. So we're done covering all the new material in Chapter 9. No more new material. So today we are going to review just how to solve these quadratic equations because we have learned 5 different methods for how to solve quadratic equations. So we're going to recap all of that. Tomorrow is going to be your review for your Chapter 9 test. So you'll have your review worksheet. We'll do that as normal. Monday we are going to review in class again. Okay? And then your test will be on Tuesday next week. Something else that I mentioned to you, but just kind of put on the radar as well, you guys will be taking your math state assessment the week after Easter. There are some students taking it next week, so if you hear students saying that they're taking their state assessment next week, they're telling the truth, but it's not you guys. Okay, we will be taking ours, like I said, after Easter break. Okay? So, quadratic equations. Really quick, just to kind of review what exactly a quadratic equation is. This year, in Algebra 1B, we primarily talked about 2 different types of equations. We talked about linear equations and quadratic equations. Linear equations, whenever you look at them, the x in the equation is just going to be an x. So the big thing that you're going to see with a quadratic equation is it's going to have an x squared. So you don't see an x squared. If that x, just an x, it's going to be a linear equation, which means if you were to look at the graph, it would be a line. If it has an x squared, that graph would be a parabola. And then to solve them, for linear equations, we just use our normal methods for solving equations. So we use inverse operations, isolate the variable, and on from there. If it is a quadratic equation, you are going to solve using one of these beautiful methods that we have learned over the past couple of weeks. So, let's review these methods. Okay, so what we have here is we have our 5 methods. It says use this method when the equation looks like this. So here's kind of what you're looking for. That's one of the things you're going to be doing today on your homework, is choosing what method that you want to use. So for graphing, you are going to use graphing, probably never, honestly. But there's one case, or a couple cases when you would use graphing. If it's a word problem, or if it is already graphed for you. If it's a word problem, sometimes it might be nice to have a visual representation of the problem. We haven't done any word problems, but I gotta give you some way to use graphing. Or like I said, there will be one on your test. It's already graphed for you. Don't solve it using one of the other methods. Just use the graph and we'll go over that, okay? The square root method, okay? Now, starting here, the square root method is going to be the method that you want to use if you can. If you can. Now, how you're going to know if you can use the square root method is there will be no x term. There will be no x term. For example, it might say 8x squared minus 32 equals 0. I have my x squared, so I know it's a quadratic equation, but I don't have an x term. The reason why we can't have an x term to use the square root method is because the square root method wants to write it like this. We want to write it into x squared equals a number. If you have an x term, you're not going to have a number on the other side. You're going to have an expression which we wouldn't be able to square root. So if you can write it as an x squared on one side and a number on the other, you definitely want to do the square root method. It is going to be easiest. Okay? Now, if you can't do the square root method, in my opinion, the next easiest method is going to be to solve by factoring. So we can't solve every equation using factoring, but when you're going to want to use factoring, if factors are easily seen, or there is no C term. If there is no C term. So let's talk about the factors easily seen first. If I have x squared plus 4x plus 3 equals 0. Remember to solve by factoring, you want to write the two parentheses, figure out, okay, here's my f, here's my l. Well, 3 times 1 would give me 3, and that would give me 4. Those factors are really easy to see. We go ahead and factor it and solve from there. Now, the no C term is the one that can be a little bit harder to see, but I promise you it's going to be much easier to solve by factoring than any of the other methods. And it might look something like this. 3x squared plus 6x equals 0. So like for the square root method, I can't have an x term. And notice for both of these, I do have an x term. I have the 4x, I have the 6x. You cannot do the square root method here. The reason why you would want to do factoring here is because if there is no C term, there's no like the 3 there, okay? How you would factor this, if there's no C term, you just have your x squared and your x, they at minimum have an x in common. At minimum, you could factor out an x. In this case, we could factor out a 3x. And if I factor out a 3x, we would get x plus 2 equals 0. And that would be pretty simple to go through and solve. 3x equals 0, x plus 2 equals 0, and on from there. So that's going to be easier than the other methods. Now, we can't always solve by factoring, or maybe you're just not into factoring. Maybe it's not one of your favorite things to do. We did have that completing the square. Now, there's a couple of things where you definitely don't want to do completing the square. It is possible, but it would be very difficult. One thing that we didn't talk about, but we're going to mention now, for completing the square, a has to be 1. Meaning the number in front of your x squared has to equal 1. So it has to just be an x squared. It can't be like a 5x squared or a 6x squared. It has to just be x squared. I'll kind of go more into that here in just a minute. Okay? The other reason, b is even. b is even. Now, here's why. So an example of one where you would do completing the square might be x squared plus 8x equals 3. Okay, first thing, it says a has to equal 1. The reason why a has to equal 1, because remember with completing the square, you're trying to get it into a quantity squared. And your f has to be x squared, because that was always an x. It has to be x times x. If this was like a 5x squared, I wouldn't be able to factor it into this. So you cannot have a number in front of the square term. Okay? The other reason where it says b is even, because remember what I do with b is I take that 8, I divide it by 2, and then I square it. If b is even, when I divide it by 2, it's going to come out as a nice, easy answer. If b is odd, I'll get a decimal or a fraction. So we don't want to do completing the square then. Okay? And then our last method that we have been doing this week is the quadratic formula. Really, for me, we're kind of getting the hang of it. I think we're getting more comfortable with it. But it is pretty time consuming, especially whenever you look at these other methods that we have. So for me, the quadratic formula is like your last resort. Okay? You're going to use the quadratic formula if no other method works. If no other method works. So for example, if I have 5x squared minus 3x plus 5 equals 0. So here's why no other method would work here. If I kind of go through my list here, for the square root method, there can be no x term. And I have an x term. Can't do the square root method. For factoring, you have to be able to factor it. For this one, since it is an ax squared, I'd have to use the airplane method. Not a big deal, but if you think about using the airplane method, you would take 5 times 5, which is 25. Your propeller would be negative 3. There are no factors of 25 that add to negative 3. You would not be able to factor that one. Okay, so I can't do factoring. Then for completing the square, a has to be 1. Oh, already fails that one. But also, b needs to be even, so it fails both of those. So I can't use any other method. So the last method, the last resort here would be the quadratic formula. Okay? Questions on any of that? Okay, once you get that copied down, let's go ahead and get that glued in. We are going to do one example of each type of solving, okay? And that's what you'll be doing in homework, so it shouldn't take too long. So the first way that we learned how to solve a quadratic equation was to solve by graphing, and that was so fun because I know you guys love graphing quadratic equations. Anyway, the reason that I said to use solving by graphing was if it's a word problem and you need a visual, we're not going to be doing any word problems, or it's already done for you. So that's going to be like what we have here. So let's say, just go ahead, it doesn't have to be perfect, but go ahead and sketch a little graph here. Okay, I want you to put a point at 0, -4, a point at -2, 0, and a point at 2, 0, and then just draw your parabola. Now, this function, this graph, is the graph y equals x squared minus 4. I want to use this graph to solve the equation 0 equals x squared minus 4. You're going to have 2 of these on your homework. These ones are so easy, guys. Because if it's already graphed for you, remember, what we're looking for here is where y equals 0. Where does this parabola cross the x-axis? And it has 2 points. You know how even whenever we did the quadratic formula or completing the square fraction, remember how we got 2 answers? Like every time? Remember why? Is because it's a parabola. The parabola goes down and back up. It usually crosses twice. Not all the time, but usually crosses twice. These are my answers. The parabola goes down at -2 and back up at 2. So your 2 answers are -2 and 2. So for the solving by graphing, finding where it crosses the x-axis. That's it. Okay, the square root method. So this is the one that I told you guys, if you can solve by the square root method, you definitely want to. So let's say we have 9x squared minus 16 equals 0. Now, first of all, how you know you can do the square root method, and you definitely want to do the square root method if you can. If you can do the square root method, there can be no x term, which notice I have my x squared, but I'm missing that x term. If I'm missing an x term, it means that I can have x squared on one side and a number on the other. So that's the first thing we want to do here is we want to write it so that I have x squared on one side and a number on the other. So if I solve for x squared, we would first add 16 to both sides. So we would have 9x squared equals 16. Okay, I still have not solved for x squared. I need to get rid of the 9. So I'm going to divide both sides by 9. Now, we talked about this whenever we did the square root method. 16 over 9, that's not going to come out evenly. So just leave it as 16 over 9. And then, now that it's just x squared, remember the whole point of solving equations is to find out what x is. I need to get rid of the squared. So to get rid of the squared, we would square root both sides. So we get x equals. Now, when you take the square root of 16, you get 4. When you take the square root of 9, you get 3. Remember what these ones, and people forget this all the time. That's not your answer. What am I missing? Plus or minus. 2 answers. Plus or minus 4 over 3. Okay, to solve by factoring, and we might do 2 of these. Okay. Okay, let's do x squared minus 5x equals negative 6. Okay, first, you definitely want to do the square root method if you can, but I cannot do the square root method here because there's this x term. So the next thing we might try is to solve by factoring. Now here's the thing, guys. To solve by factoring, what you're trying to get this to look like is that. You're trying to get it to say something times something equals 0. So the first thing you have to do has to be set equal to 0. So I need to add 6 to both sides. So we have x squared minus 5x plus 6 equals 0. Now what we're trying to do is factor this. So if my f is x squared, I know that that would have to be x times x. To get my L, I need something that multiplies to give me a positive 6, but then the O and I are going to add to give me negative 5. Any ideas? Now, if I did 6 and 1, in order to get a negative 5, it'd have to be negative 6 and 1, but negative 6 times 1 would give me a negative 6. Negative 2 and negative 3. So it'd be x minus 2, x minus 3. Now remember, with solving by factoring, your next step, if I have something times something equal to 0, the only way that's possible is if one of these is 0. Either x minus 2 equals 0, or x minus 3 equals 0. So I would add 2, so x could be 2. Add 3, x could be 3. There's your 2 answers. Okay, and actually instead of adding a new one here, let's go back to that left-hand side. Let's just finish out this one here. So I kind of wrote this one down that I said to solve by factoring, it either needs to be factored easily, which is what we just did. Factors are easily seen. Or I said that there can be no C term. Now remember with these ones, the reason why we want to factor that there's no C term, if it's just an x squared plus x, they at minimum have an x in common. So you can factor out the x. Okay, and that's what we did here. We got 3x times x plus 2. Once you get to this step, you do the same thing. If 3x times x plus 2 equals 0, that means either 3x equals 0 or x plus 2 equals 0. So for the first one, divide by 3, we get x equals 0. Subtract 2, we get x equals negative 2. There's your 2 answers there. So this is what it would look like that other way of factoring. Okay, now, completing the square. You guys were getting really, really good at completing the square last week. I was really proud of you guys because it's definitely not an easy thing to do. So let's practice one with completing the square. So it says x squared plus 4x equals 10. Now the reason why we would probably want to use completing the square here, I can't do the square root method because there's the x term. I'm not going to be able to factor it. If you move the 10 over, you'd be looking for factors of negative 10, and at 4 it's not able to be factored. But it's a good candidate for completing the square because a is 1, there's another number from your x squared, and b is even. So remember, for the completing the square, this is what you're trying to do with completing the square. You're trying to get it into something squared equals a number. Now, in order to factor this into this, okay, I've got my x times x. I've got my f. But remember, I need a number there, right, that's going to go right here, okay? So to find that number, to find that magic number, this is where we take our b, the 4, divide it by 2, and we square it. 4 divided by 2 is 2. 2 squared is 4. So I would add 4 to both sides, remember, because it's math and there's rules. So I'd have x squared plus 4x plus 4, and on the right-hand side, 10 plus 4 gives me 14. Now I could factor in here my x times x. I'm going to drop down to that plus sign, and then look at that L that we just found to get the 4. we would take 2 times 2. And it still equals 14 on the right. Now remember what we do next. If I could get rid of that squared, it would just be x plus 2, which would be super easy to solve. So to get rid of the squared, we square root both sides. The square and the square root cancel each other out. So we just get dx plus 2. On the right-hand side, anytime you take that square root, you're going to have that plus or minus. When you take the square root of 14, you get about 3.7. And then lastly, to get rid of the plus 2, we would subtract 2. So to get your two answers, you would take negative 2 plus or minus 3.7. Negative 2 plus 3.7 is 1.7. Negative 2 minus 3.7 is negative 5.7. Okay, and then the last one is the one that we've been doing here. So the quadratic formula. So let's say we have negative 2x squared minus 5x plus 6 equals 0. So this one for sure is not a good candidate for any of the other ones. I can't do the perfect square method. I can't factor it. I can't do completing the square. So the only method that will work would be the quadratic formula. It's already set equal to 0. So I can say A would be negative 2. B would be negative 5. C would be 6. So when I plug these into the quadratic formula, we would get x equals, and we're going to take the opposite of b, which would be positive 5, plus or minus the square root. B squared would be negative 5 squared minus 4 times a, which is negative 2, times c, which is 6, all over 2a, which is 2 times negative 2. So that first step in simplifying, 5 plus or minus the square root. Negative 5 squared, remember, doesn't matter if it's negative or positive, it's going to give you a positive answer, so that would be a positive 25. Now right here, I have a negative 4 and a negative 2. Those two negatives are going to make that a positive sign. 4 times 2 times 6 gives me 48. And then 2 times negative 2 gives me negative 4. So we're going to get 5 plus or minus 25 plus 48 gives me 73 over negative 4. When I take the square root of 73, we get about 8.5 over negative 4. And then we can break it apart into our two answers. 5 plus 8.5 is 13.5. Divide that by negative 4, we get negative 3.4. 5 minus 8.5 is negative 3.5. Divide that by negative 4, we get 0.8.